Please give a warm applause to Jose Martin Marquez for his beautiful music. Thank you. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you, Francisca. Okay, happy Mother's Day to all the moms. It's a Mother's Day weekend, so I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And let me know if you want to hear something. If I know it, I'll sing it. In the meantime, I'll sing this one for y'all. Para bailar la bamba se necesita una poca de gracia y otra cosita y arriba, ahí arriba iré, por ti seré, bamba, 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 bamba. Yo no soy marinero, soy capitán, bamba, 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 bamba. Para subir al cielo se necesita una escalera grande y otra chiquita y arriba, ahí arriba iré, por ti seré, bamba, 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 bamba. Para bailar la bamba se necesita una poca de gracia y otra cosita y arriba, ahí arriba iré, por ti seré, bamba, 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 bamba. Quisiera tener la dicha que el gallo tiene, de tener muchas gallinas y a ninguna las mantiene. Ay, longo, el sombrero me lo quito, me lo pongo. Y longo, el sombrero me lo quito, me lo pongo. No vamos al templo a que nos bendiga el Padre. Nos tenemos que casar aunque no quiera tu madre. Cupido te pido de compasión que se acabe la bamba. Ven otro son ahí arriba, ahí arriba iré. Yo no soy marinero, por ti seré, bamba, 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 bamba. Thank you.
Before we start the last song, if Amber Ortega is out there, is Amber Ortega here? Please come up to the stage if you can hear me, or if anyone knows where she's at. I heard she's been seen. Okay, all right, come on down, Amber, thank you.
She's getting nachos.
Yeah, well, they're so good, huh?
Qué bonitos ojos tienes, debajo de esas dos cejas, qué bonitos ojos tienes. Ellos me quieren mirar, pero si tú no los dejas, siquiera parpadear. Malagueña, malagueña salerosa, besar tus labios quisiera, besar tus labios quisiera, malagueña salerosa, y decirte niña hermosa, que eres linda y hechicera, que eres linda y hechicera como el candor de una rosa. Si por pobre me desprecias, yo te concedo razón, yo te concedo razón. Si por pobre me desprecias, yo no te ofrezco riquezas, te ofrezco mi corazón, te ofrezco mi corazón a cambio de mis pobrezas. Malagueña, malagueña salerosa, besar tus labios quisiera, besar tus labios quisiera, malagueña salerosa, y decirte niña hermosa, que eres que eres linda y hechicera como el candor de una rosa. Como el candor de una rosa. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Gracias a ustedes. Gracias. Con permiso.
Sí, pase, por favor. Qué hermosa la música, ¿no? Yes.
¿Y están bien alimentados? You're well fed? Yes, excellent. Okay, so welcome back. And we'd like to thank Little Mexico and their staff for providing and serving lunch today. And of course, thank you also to our talented performers, Jose Martin Marquez and the Songhai drummers. So now, yes, let's give them a thank you. Yeah, we're ready to go. We now turn to our second panel of speakers, and they will get us thinking about our relationships to the earth and to each other by presenting their own work and examples of acting locally with regard to the land, labor, and the climate. So I'm going to share with you who our panelists are and a little description of each, and they will soon be coming out and taking a seat at the table. Hint, hint. So our first panelist is joining us remotely, and that is Dr. Fuchsia Ann Hoover, and she is an interdisciplinary researcher specializing in social ecological urban systems. She employs a range of approaches, perspectives that include environmental justice, green infrastructure performance, and urban planning, evaluating the impacts of green infrastructure planning in the context of racism, justice, and placemaking. Dr. Hoover is currently a fellow at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute in Boston, Massachusetts. So welcome, Dr. Hoover. Next we have, yes, Stephen Valencia. Stephen, are you here? Yes, please join us at the table. So Stephen moved to Tucson in 1971. He is an executive board member of the United Steelworkers Union, Local 6912, and participated in the 3-year historic copper strike against Phelps Dodge. He founded the Salt of the Earth Labor College and the Coalition of Tucson Jobs with Justice, of which he is currently executive director. So welcome, Stephen. Next, we have Amber Ortega. There she is. And she is a descendant of the Iased Odom and an enrolled member of the Tohono O'odham Nation. In 2020, Amber was arrested for protecting the sacred site Quito Baquito during border construction. Her work over the years has been focused on working with traditional O'odham seeds with mentors from Tohono O'odham Community College. Amber recently earned her Associates in Arts in Social Work and teaches from her experiences of loss, generational trauma, and empowerment through displacement. Welcome, Amber. And our final finalist is Blake Gentry. Blake, there you are. Blake advocates, researches, and writes about Indigenous peoples' rights in migration, climate change, community health, and Indigenous languages. In 2023, he completed a study on traditional Indigenous knowledge and climate adaptation for the United Nations Development Program in Bhutan, and a climate and international migration survey at the Arizona border for Indigenous Alliance Without Borders. Blake also works with Alianza Indígena Sin Fronteras and EmmaConsultants.org, LLC. So welcome, Blake.
Thank you.
Thank you. So this panel is called Relationships to Earth and Each Other, Land, Labor, and Climate. And I just wanted to remind you, when you speak in the microphone, please put it right close to your mouth. Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Am I going first? Okay. Okay. Just wanted to make sure. All right. Let me just share my screen.
So Dr. Hoover, you're up first.
Great. Oh, I need screen sharing abilities.
Okay, we'll work on that.
Hi, Dr. Hoover. It's Francisca. How are you?
Hi.
They're working on the screen share right now. Do you think, yeah, hold on. Let me see if it would be better to start with you or someone else. But hold on. So while our technicians are getting the screen share worked out, we're going to go on to the second panelist, who is Steven Valencia. Thank you.
Yo, is it pretty good over there? It sounds like it is. Let me begin by pointing out the billions of dollars that are funding massive projects geared to a decarbonized environment to stop the climate crises. Arizona is a recipient of historic allocations of funds to build microchip factories, battery plants, increasing educational centers that include apprenticeship readiness and pathways to enter registered apprenticeship programs in the construction trades and in many other occupations. The funding is not only for infrastructure in terms of roads and bridges, safety and public transit, passenger and freight rail, electric vehicle infrastructure, airports, water infrastructure, resiliency, broadband infrastructure, power infrastructure, and cleanup of abandoned mines. The creation and the funding of these jobs leads with the policy of social equity. The social equity part is to make these jobs available and accessible to historically deprived communities. The policy is about bringing into massive jobs programs the indigenous, Black, people of color, LGBTQ, and all vulnerable communities into the national green economic upsurge. The $1.2 trillion over 8 years in this investment in our country reminds me of the New Deal programs, like the Works Progress Administration of President Roosevelt, that gave rise to the Civilian Conservation Corps that allowed thousands of working class youth to learn basic trades of construction, and they got paid by while doing it. The Civilian Conservation Corps was not only to build needed infrastructure in our nation, but it was also to build people and allow opportunities to learn trades and be a skilled worker. The increase of the power of labor is captured in this moment of massive jobs programs and the conscious and deliberate inclusion and accessibility of BIPOC, LGBTQ, and all vulnerable communities. The increase in the power of labor is manifested quite obviously in the United Auto Workers and their determined stand-up strike against the Big Three and their very recent union contract at the Volkswagen Chattanooga plant in East Tennessee. But it is also recognized in the efforts of the Starbucks workers, who just won a seat at the negotiating table for a union contract. This labor power is called collective bargaining. It is bargaining with the boss to gain wages, benefits, security, pension, succession clauses, health and safety protections. But there is an expanded concept of collective bargaining that includes using labor power to help the community. A union, for example, can use their labor power to negotiate separate housing funds to defray the huge cost of shelter for union members and their families. The trade unions are the most organized sector of the working class, and that's why the bosses and big corporations are always looking to attack them. Union membership is low in Arizona, but we recognize that it was this intention of the 1947 Right to Work for Less law that was passed. The law doesn't prohibit union organizing, but it makes it much more difficult to sustain. Our labor history reminds us that we need a vibrant and continued effort to increase our labor power through our unions and the strategic support of the broad community. Even though the road has been difficult, we still see minimum wage ordinances passed in our fair city with enforcement mechanisms, prevailing wage guarantees for work within the metropolitan area of Tucson, tributes to labor leaders as Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, a progressive labor liaison in the mayor's office, a promising engagement with the Arizona Building and Construction Trades Council, and now we have the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act that are massive jobs programs with social equity, strong labor enforcement, and the protection of immigrants as workers. The deep exploitation of immigrant workers, documented thoroughly in the construction trades, and an even more profound exploitation of immigrant women in the building trades, has been a focus of our Arizona Job of Justice in partnership with the Department of Labor, Wage and Hour Division, Arizona State and National AFL-CIO, the Arizona Building and Construction Trades Council, with a tremendous effort by the Painters Union, national staff from Job of Justice, pro-immigrant community organizations like Coalición de Derechos Humanos and Southside Worker Center for makes positive engagement. The Department of Labor has won cases now in the millions of dollar settlements on wage theft of immigrant workers, but the Department of Labor has difficulty in locating the immigrant workers, and consequently, their wages are kept for 18 months. Then, due to not finding the workers, the money is sent to the U.S. Treasury. In some cases, the immigrant worker is suggested to go to the Department of Labor office to pick up their check, but upon seeing uniformed security officers doing routine metal detection, the immigrant worker will not enter due to the fear of federal agents and deportation. So they leave without their paycheck. That money should at least stay in Arizona in the hands of pro-immigrant community organizations where there is trust, confidence, and establishing a model of how to contact immigrant workers whose wages were stolen, then paid, and then held by the Department of Labor. A major reason for the astounding profits of corporations is the wage theft of immigrant labor. A local organization of which Arizona Job of Justice is part, called Stop the Hate Collective, has in their 12-point pledge a special point on the economic basis of the hatred toward immigrants. And it is a fact that these immigrants are a vast majority in some building trades and are already building the infrastructure of our cities and country. Their training and apprenticeships in the building trades should afford automatic citizenship and full membership in unions if they choose, with a vote in all elections and compensation of all the wages that were stolen by corporations. Right now, the law offers protection of immigrant workers in the form of deferred action, that is for 2 years, but should be extended to at least 4 years, during which they are part or witness to a case involving wage theft, sexual harassment, or any violation of their labor rights. 4 years ago, encouraging immigrants to obtain the deferred action was very slow due to the history of Homeland Security and other federal agencies. But the number of immigrants has increased and has encouraged others to pursue this legal protection. Many thanks to the AFL-CIO, the building trades unions, worker centers, immigrant organizations, the Department of Labor, and especially the courageous immigrant themselves. In closing, I would like to invite you to join Arizona Job of Justice. We have 2 Zoom meetings per month. There is no fee to join. We are an intergenerational and have experience in the worker struggles, and would be very happy to call you a coalition partner. Also, on May 17th and 18th in Phoenix, there will be an in-person strategy session with presentations from folks in the country of their efforts to be a part of this clean, green economy and lifting all vulnerable communities. Thank you.
We think we might have the share screen issue resolved, so we're going to give it a try. Dr. Hoover, would you like to give it a try?
Okay, so hopefully you all can see my screen.
Yes, I think we can.
Okay, great, awesome. I'll try to keep the chat up just in case there's any issues. So the title here is a little bit different than what you all probably see in your programs. Part of that is trying to make things a bit more relevant to Phoenix. But I figured it would be helpful to kind of start a bit about, the type of work that I'm doing and things that I'm thinking about in the landscape. So these are just a couple pictures of different types of green infrastructure practices, which is where a lot of my work is rooted. And they can, look like a variety of things depending on where they are or what the kind of climate conditions of the region where they're implemented. But a lot of it originally starts with managing, flooding or rain water. And as you see, like in some of the curb cuts, right, you can use vegetation that's more adapted for drier conditions. It can be vegetation or building materials, other types of things. And one of the kind of aspects that I'm really interested in, particularly with cities, is the relationship and interaction between things like the practices that you just saw and something called like uneven geographies and environmental justice. And so this is an unfamiliar term. It essentially is just describing the differences between how amenities or services, other types of resources are distributed across the landscape. And part of that also does go into, who is making those decisions, the planners, the engineers, or policymakers that are, approving comprehensive plans or other policies. And so, alongside of this, I'm also really interested in thinking about the types of actions that are taken by either the city or individuals or communities in order to, prevent future harm or increase the relational value of community members and residents to their physical environment, the natural environment, both in and outside of urban spaces. And so this is the kind of working definition of justice that I also use in my work in thinking about how well are these practices being implemented or integrated into the landscape. And a lot of this is really important. I'm trained as an engineer. I'm in a geography department where I'm technically the, environmental planner. And this image here from a paper that came out in 2020 is really illustrative of why these things are so connected, right? And I know that many of you in the room and on the panel also know these things already. But sometimes they're difficult to see in different types of spaces, right? But this really demonstrates how our understandings of different biases or how structural racism comes to shape the landscapes that we live in and can even impact the actual like ecological biodiversity that we see, whether you're in a rural or agricultural space or urban space. And we see this in different types of studies over and over again. So we see this looking at the study was examining tree canopy cover and the percentage of cover across cities in the United States that mirrored and kind of aligned with former Holt grades. And the Holt grading system was what gives us this terminology of redlining. So housing segregation, racial segregation based on, if you were Black or Jewish or even immigrant to this country, the places that you were not just allowed to live, but the access to home equity loans that you were given. And so the red is the neighborhoods that were given a D, and it goes, up from D to A color. And you can see that pattern where, the historical grade of D corresponds to lower canopy cover overall. And this also has impacts in terms of tree adoption programs and different types of efforts that have been implemented in cities since then to try and remediate some of these things. But we can also see it even in things like air quality. So this is a study that was looking at PM 2.5, which is one of the most common metrics used to assess poor air quality. So the higher the percentage, the lower the air quality. And we can see again, right, that for communities that are Hispanic and Black, and below the poverty line, there's higher exposures that they are experiencing. The other interesting thing about the study was they were also looking at the producers of air pollution, right, and found the converse to be true. So folks that are in these groups of higher exposure are also the least likely to produce the particulate matter coming from different industries or technologies. And of course, as a final example, we can see this even in flooding claims. This was from Chicago, where two extreme rain events took place, and they decided to look at flooding claims based on the percentage households of color. So you see this trend kind of over and over in different types of environmental measurements and resources. And importantly, you also see it, with green space overall. So it doesn't even have to be a material used for flooding. It can be, as that one study pointed out, right, something as simple as trees. And these are just a couple examples from cities. But even if we think about, Phoenix and the greater Phoenix area, we can think about and know what like the yards look like if you're walking through Tempe, for example, versus if you're in the South Mountain community area, right? So both the kind of resource or amenity that is green space, lawn space or other types of vegetation, but also the location and proximity of different types of industries. So in terms of thinking through this work, and how I'm trying to explore the way environmental justice is implemented in planning, some of the work that I'm doing now, looking at Black feminist ecologies. Part of this started from a large study I did with a couple colleagues looking at city plans across the US, and I highlighted Phoenix. Phoenix was one of our plans that we looked at, one of our cities. And so, we were really interested in how cities were thinking about green infrastructure, how they were thinking about environmental justice, understand in what ways there was alignment or disalignment between, the rationale for these practices and the actual criteria used to locate these things in the landscape. And, most of the plans that we looked at had at least a quarter that were dedicated specifically to green infrastructure. And, the kind of content related to how much of that was, oh, and the red bar is still there. Sorry about that. How much of that was related to environmental justice, I've highlighted for you here, right? So you could kind of see how small a percentage that language was across these plans. And this is the kind of aggregate of all of the city plans that we looked at. And just for a bit more context on Phoenix, these were the 4 plans that we had examined. And, the study is from a couple years ago now. So this is from 2021, 2022. But what was interesting was when we looked at environmental justice criteria, it just accounted for a little over 1% of the total criteria that we found. And unfortunately, Phoenix was not one of the cities that had explicit language related to environmental justice or addressing environmental racism. Now, there are, of course, other, county, Maricopa County plans and newer city plans that have come out that may now contain that language. But at the time, this is what we found. What we did find, though, was that there was quite a bit, and I say this generously, of content and kind of rationale related to heat, which makes sense in the context of Arizona. And so there was certainly a connection in terms of maybe not explicitly identifying neighborhoods of color or people of color as places to actually focus efforts, like the example to the right. But identifying areas where, there may be reduced canopy coverage or trying to build other types of restorative habitats that could, in theory, provide benefits to the communities where there may be lacking habitats or components of that landscape. And so really when we think then about kind of the policies that may go alongside this, one of the things that I did want to highlight was a recent plan that came out last year looking at kind of an update to plan evaluation specifically for heat resilience. And so you'll see from this, from the plans that they looked at in this study, there three out of the 4 plans did contain quite a bit of public participation, which I think is one of the things that's probably the most rare in all of this. But we can also look at some of the correlations between what they have a peers heat net scorecard map and alignment against the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, right? So you can kind of see where some of those high heat, high temperatures, particularly in the summer, correlate to areas considered to be more vulnerable, which are usually, right, are areas that are communities of color, lower income communities. And so for the work I'm starting now, just to kind of tie things all together, a lot of this is really being pulled from the work of Bell Hooks as a source of inspiration and the work that she focused on in this essay of home places and as a resistance or a space of resistance. And in this case, Hooks references trying to do the work of healing the wounds inflicted by racist domination. And I'm really interested in also thinking about how this applies to ecological wounds and community wounds and personal wounds, right? How all of these 3 things are connected in the way that so much of the policies that we've seen be really successful, that advocate for communities of color and justice are coming from our communities, right? And that we really have the tools and are already doing the organizing or the planning that in many ways, I think my work is trying to elevate and move into a more, formalized process so that both the people who are already doing the work can be highlighted, and that hopefully the plans themselves and the implementation of those plans can actually be more just, opposed to kind of what we're seeing now, where there's a lot of interest or rationale or motivation, but not as much on the kind of actual implementation side. So I will stop there because I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you all.
Okay, so I'm really excited for this. I get to give you all a brief history, and I'm going to keep an eye on the clock. So this is a little history lesson that is not taught too often. How many of you are familiar with the Tahanawattam Nation? All right, how many of you are familiar with the Akamil Atam? Okay, how many are you familiar with Ankh Akamil? And how many of you have heard of Hiacharatam? Okay. If any of you looked around, you can see there's a big difference. And so why this is important is because as Hiacharatam, as mentioned earlier, I was arrested in 2020. And so I need to give a backstory as to how and why that's an injustice that needs to be taught, because as Hiacharatam, we exist. We are not an extinct tribe. We are a tribe that was intentionally displaced and disregarded by the United States of America. And the reason this is important is because our displacement resulted in the Organ Pipe National Monuments establishment, including the Berry Goldwater bombing range that is currently being used for practice and has been used since the creation of this bombing range, and also the Phelps Dodge Corporation and the Cabeza Prieta Wildlife Refuge. So why this is important is because we are aware of the Gadsden Purchase, the purchase of this area. And the reason this is important is because there was a large effort. There's the Spanish conquistador, and then there's the United States of America's effort to force and assimilate Native American tribes. And what they did specifically here in Arizona with Hiacharatam was first of all, they went and they researched our communities, they researched our people, they documented specifically Hiacharatam, knowing Hiacharatam are separate than Tahanawattam, Hiacharatam are separate than Akamilratam, Hiacharatam are not the same as Ankh Akamil. And what they did was they, in 1976, paid $26 million to the Tahanawattam Nation. And so at that time, the Tahanawattam Nation was established. And so the people of Arizona are believed, that nations are being established, right? Nation and nation. So where the Hiacharatam reside historically is between the Tahanawattam Nation and west of Yuma. So in Yuma, there's the Quechan Nation and the Kokopah. So we had, as Hiacharatam, a land base between Yuma and between what people are aware of as the Tahanawattam Nation. And so what the government did was they excluded Hiacharatam. They would arrest Hiacharatam for harvesting. They were wrongfully convicting Hiacharatam. They were intentionally accusing families of crimes they were not committing. They were taking family members to a Yuma prison and leaving them for years. And there's epidemics our people also faced. And so the reason I feel like this is really important is because, again, our lands are currently under the care of Organ Pipe National Monument. And our lands extend from the American side, what's considered the American side, into the Mexico side. And Why this is such a huge injustice for our people is because Quito Paquito, also known as Aaravapia, is a Hiacharatam sacred site, and it exists along the Mexico border, the US-Mexico border. And what made this such a drastic injustice for our people was our elders for generations fought with the United States of America to prove that we were here as a people present. And then for 50 years, the Hiacharatam fought for recognition with the Tohono Nation because we knew we were not an extinct tribe. And in 2013, we were given a district, and that meant we had a say at the seat with other O'odham. And that district was dismantled within 2 years. And a lot of us, generations, this younger generation, we believe that it was another effort to keep our people disempowered, to keep our people out of, what we feel needs to be done with our lands. And, I just need to give this example of the Barry Goldwater bombing range. So for generations now, it's surrounded by sacred sites that are sacred to Hiacharatam. And, before this war broke out, there was reports. There's been reports for years of there being mosque-like structures out in our tribal lands built by the government where they bomb and we're preparing for this current war. And the reason this is also important is because as Hiacharatam, as O'odham, as Tohono O'odham, as Native Americans in the United States of America, we believe that yes, not only are our traditional ways targeted, but our lands are used as scientific experiments and research projects. And this is also very important to understand is because Quito Paquito is home to endangered species. Quito Paquito is home to an immense amount of medicinal plants. Quito Paquito, Aaravapia was Hiacharatam's classroom. It was where we learned about each plant. It's where we connected, it's where we prayed. It's also home to a traditional burial site it defines us as to who we are because our burials are different than the Tohono O'odham. And okay, I need to wrap this up. I put on here decolonizing the legume because this is so important. What displacement did, what the Western diet did, was it took us from our traditional harvest, our traditional plants, planting legumes. If you know anything about legumes, beans, they are nitrogen fixers, which means, and so this is also why we need all the trees. And if you're aware of Oak Flat, please look it up. Please stick up for Oak Flat because we're also facing a drought. What they did during border wall construction and what they want to do with mining operations, we're well aware of the immense amount of water that's required. During border wall construction, the reason this was important was there was an estimate of 110,000 gallons of water per day being pumped from the ground. We're already in a dry, desolate area where our plants are already, under an immense amount of stress, and our people. So what we feel the government did, we've called it a racist administration. It was a Trump administration. They did not seek consultation with the Tohono O'odham Nation. They did not consult with Hiacharatam. What they did was they tapped into our groundwater and they depleted areas. They scattered animals. They endangered our species that are already in an immense amount of stress. They, again, are well aware of other efforts. Our Hiacharatam lands have been used for mining operations, and what we see left after these mining operations is the poverty and the abuse and the sadness and the trauma. And so why I say empowerment through displacement is because we have to understand that not only are our plants that were removed sacred and necessary, but so are we, because it's a solution to global transformation, global climates. If we return the legumes back to all the traditional lands, all the traditional sites globally, we actually have the ability to, dissipate carbon dioxide. It's in the plants, and You know, we are aware of, for instance, researchers, you know, they want to create this genetically modified legume, but the traditional legumes themselves, in their abundance, if planted and returned to the communities, and the people, if they're promoted in those communities to work with the land versus an organization or a corporation, how much will, you know, our soils benefit? How much will the spirit benefit? How much will our communities benefit? And so that's just a gist of why it was so necessary to defend Quito Paquito, also known as Aravapia. And please, it's for the ecosystem. You know, there's an immense amount of contamination, and there's a lot of effort that we want people to apply, you know, when it comes to their own personal homes, especially if you live in Arizona because of the predicted drought in the water, you know, the water drastically declining. It's necessary to learn to plant, to grow, and then also to understand natural vegetation, what plants consume an immense amount of water. One of the things historically that we know of that Father Kino did, right? So Father Kino introduced a whole different diet, a whole different food system, and what he did at Quito Paquito was he planted different trees, different fruit trees that are not native to our area, and some of those, you know, are known to need and be very reliant on water. So I really am grateful that you are open to hearing about Hiacharatam and Organ Pipe National Monument and also our struggles. And really quick, just so you know, a lot of people think, you know, for instance, pirkan, wheat, you know, wheat and fry bread, those are traditionals. But no, that's part of the assimilation, removing us from our lands, creating, you know, these communities and then depriving us of access to our sacred sites. That's an act of genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. I'm going to start right away. My name is Blake Gentry. I'm a member of the Cherokee Nation. And the presentation today is called Violent Underpinnings of Climate Change Migration. You might wonder about that title. If you would like an alternative title, it might be Regional Free Trade and Migration and How We Got Here. So I really thank the college, Francisca, and all those who put this summit together, the panelists earlier, and Steve and Amber now with me at this table. And what I want to say is that free trade and migration is the purpose of this talk, but there's some climate data that you will see later on through interviews that were done in October of last year at the Elita shelter. So our focus is on the regional economic model known as the free trade model put together by neoliberal states covering Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, Mexico, the US, and Canada. And this quote above you see on this slide suggests that individual effort under the right circumstances determined by national governments can free up workers to improve their human well-being. To see how that's worked out, we're first going to focus on the part defined there as strong private property rights. But to think about what this means, we must recognize first how neoliberalism actually came into being. Yesterday I was told that I'm not just nearsighted but farsighted, so I consider myself an elder now. So I'm going to take this opportunity to give a little history and then bring it into the current. So where did neoliberalism start? In the Americas it started in Chile. It actually was at the birth of the overthrow of a democratically elected government and put in a dictatorship in order to launch the neoliberal economic model. So the idea that neoliberalism is going to create democracy is actually, in fact, the opposite. It teaches us an ideology that David Harvey states is necessary to guarantee markets even if they do not exist. That's the job of the state, and to use force if necessary in order to enforce those markets. You'll see in this slide a bit of meandering here. It's an attempt to try to encapsulate some of the landmarks of neoliberalism that would affect us. The current governing economic policy that continues to run in Central America and Mexico was originally recast in the 1990s and the 2000s with the passage of the North America Free Trade Agreement in 94 and the Central America Free Trade Agreement in 2005, known as NAFTA and CAFTA. And yes, there was a reform of NAFTA, but it's basically the same thing. And this produced violent results before its decline under President Trump in 2018, and then Biden's continuation in 2021 of a rejection of the free trade idea. This violent birth in the Americas didn't just stop with Chile, though. It was also the case for its launch in Mexico and then in Central America. If we recall, in the case of CAFTA, CAFTA followed the assistance of the United States' direct and indirect support of the Civil War in Guatemala from 1952, when there was a coup d'etat, and up to 1995 during the ceasefire when I entered that country, which ended in over 600 massacres, mostly of indigenous peoples in Guatemala. Note the red dots on the slide, the part on the left, that map. In Mexico, after the EZLN rebelled against NAFTA, the Mexican government then disregarded the San Andres Accords, negotiated directly with the EZLN, and abandoned the principle of collectively held indigenous lands, private property. This slide shows you one of the promises of neoliberalism, and that is that more capital distributed more equally around the world is going to lift all boats. There was a president named Clinton who used to talk like that. And that all of the region was going to be transformed by outside investment. Here you see that Latin America is supposedly favored in this schema. It's the green line, but if you dig down into the details, you would find out, like I did, in 2022, FDI dropped off from Central America by about 12%. This slide shows us legal migration to the United States and different regions of the world, and you see that the biggest region there, if you put the North/Central America and the Mexico part of that together with Central America, it is the largest region sending legal workers to the United States. And then if you look at this slide here, you'll see on the left a preponderance of people coming still to the United States over the past 3 years, and the graph on the right, which Pew Research got wrong, says that it's not Central Americans and Mexicans who are the majority of the people coming, but that data ended in December of last year, and 2 months ago, the Biden administration got rid of temporary protective status for Venezuelans. So back again, it's Mexicans and Central Americans who are the majority of people migrating to this country, and they have been for the last 25 years. This slide shows us a very long trajectory of migration. You'll see both the proportional amount of migration on the bottom line, and then the purple line goes up, and you'll see that exponentially, interestingly, 1994, you start to see immigration go way up after NAFTA was passed, and then you see some years later, by 2018, being the populist that he is, Trump was talking about the rights of workers, and he started the one who, in the sanction regimes against the free trade coming out of China. There's some logic to that, and then again, we see how this relationship is between migration and policies. This slide is pretty much a continuation of the same thing, except you have evidence of President Biden now doubling down on restricting free trade under neoliberalism. So we might ask the question, if that's the case, then why does the immigration part of neoliberalism continue? Because the free trade has not. There's lots of sanctions against China. Things are being redirected to Mexico. Mexico is now the largest exporter to the United States. It's no longer China. It's turned back into our favored nation country just recently in the last 6 months. So what does this mean? Well, for one, trade agreements facilitated some national economic sectors to lock in monopolies for production, thus empowering the elites of those countries and U.S. corporations to be economically dominant. On the U.S. side, agricultural and service sectors, including construction sector, like Steve was mentioning, want displaced and undocumented migrants as a guarantee of supply of cheap labor. What began as a displacement of agricultural workers in NAFTA and CAFTA countries ends up in a permanent dispossession of the private property of entire families. Here you're going to see some graphs quickly. I don't want to bore you with, they may not be that visible. The graph on the left shows poverty levels in Honduras, Guatemala, Salvador, and all the countries in Latin America. The one on the right, the stacked bars on the left of that graph basically say that the level in Mexico from 2010 to 2022 is still at 36%. So 12 years later, there's been no change in the poverty levels in Mexico despite the promises of free trade. Here we see again, under COVID, there's this inflationary aspect that happens. Everybody knows about this around the world. But what happens in Latin America is they don't rebound from the COVID inflation. The COVID inflation has continued. You see here Guatemala, Mexico, Salvador, Honduras, etc. And Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and El Salvador are within the top 10 of those affected in Latin America by the inflation because of COVID, which deteriorates their ability to eat. Here we have a slide that tells us that Afro descendants and indigenous peoples make up 67% of all poverty in Latin America. That's the case for the region that we're targeting. Here we see that one of the violent underpinnings of all of that poverty ends up being stunted. If you've never seen stunted children, excuse me, like I have in the shelter at Elitas here in Tucson, it's shocking and it's violent. And Guatemala is the king of stunted children in Latin America. As it's so bad that in Guatemala in 2014 they stopped publishing poverty statistics. You can't find them. The other violent underpinning is the lack of governance in these countries. If you are threatened by a local gang, you can't go to the police because the police are bought off by cartel, and cartel makes deals with the governments, and the governments end up being narco states. This isn't just a few sectors, this is systemic in these countries. So we have produced through this trade agreements governance which is weak and which doesn't protect people and allows them to be victimized by violence. And a third underpinning, which is quite violent, is what happens here at the border. We know that the MPP and Title 42 policies produced by the Trump administration and carried out by the Biden administration produce more deaths. What you probably don't know, that is in Pima County, those deaths, when you compare the two 4-year periods, increased by 31%, and on the Tanatam Nation, they increased by 66.7%. Third underpinning of free trade agreements, the forced migration of people into Arizona. This is a map of the same thing. What happened in the border when people were not allowed in, Mexicans and Central Americans, specifically under COVID policies, Title 42, is that the cartels there don't really engage in random violence. What they engage in is violence for profit. And this research that we did in the Indigenous Languages Office, using data from another organization, shows that 85% of violent acts were for the purpose of extracting profit, and profit they extracted. So you have seen three violent underpinnings of climate change, having to do with the economic system in which climate change happens in Central America. Now we're going to talk more directly about climate change and what happened with the 60 migrants that I interviewed. What I learned was that 59% of them were between the ages of 18 and 29, 53% were female, most were from Guatemala, there was an overrepresentation of indigenous, most of them were farmers, 65%, worked on their family farms, 65% were farmers, but others worked part-time or seasonally in agriculture, so we're up to 68% of the people that I interviewed said that they made their livelihoods through farming. 76% derive their income, 3/4 of their income from farming. And when I asked them why they migrated, if they migrated because their livelihoods had been ruined because of climate change, 50% said yes. Nevertheless, I asked them, are there any other reasons why you came to the United States? And they also answered as well. I think I got this out of order. No, okay. And when I asked them about climate changes, they were very able to report to me climate changes. You can see all the different types of climate changes that they talked about, but we can make this a little bit simpler with this analysis, and you can see that abnormal rains were 37% of what they reported. When you put in winds, which were usually associated with those rains, you get about 59% of those climate changes that they were able to tell me about, and then abnormal heat. Now, the abnormal heat is what climate scientists are focusing on, interestingly, in Central America. That makes up the area which is not very well defined, called the dry corridor. What does this mean in terms of impacts? The impacts that they talked about were to the basic foodstuffs that they used to serve to keep their families fed, and that's corn destroyed for 64% of them, and coffee, if you combine rust and destroyed plants, you get 37%. By the way, these are commercial crops down there, cotton and palm oil. Those are what's exported to the United States. Here we see other crops destroyed. Notice beans, 32% still, that's a crop that you eat, mostly not sell. And then here are fruit trees. At the bottom, we have bananas and plantains, and then we got green bananas, we got mangoes and oranges. Less losses of percentage, 12%, 6.5 to 8%. All of these reported to me by migrants I met in the shelter. So we asked them why they came. 50% said, yes, because of climate change impacts on my livelihood, but another 60% said, yeah, and there's another reason. So what are those reasons? We offered them 7 or 8 reasons. We offered them the ability to write down their own reasons, and then I asked them to scale this from 1 to 5. Here's where their answers. This shows those who scaled it at between 4 and 5. So you see there's a variety of reasons here, and depending on how you ask somebody, you're going to get different answers, because people don't imagine their lives only in the framework of climate change, or only in the framework of being persecuted or threatened, or only in the framework of having their livelihoods destroyed. They think of themselves as whole beings in countries in which they basically are experiencing underdevelopment. So that's the fourth violent underpinning of climate change, is that many of them are being forced out of the areas because the climate change is not being adapted by these countries' governments. Our own government said that we've dedicated $1.4 billion so that people don't have to migrate. I really don't see that happening yet. It seems like we're paying a lot of attention to 2 other wars, but the constant problem that was produced by this economic model since its implementation continues, even though the principle of free trade has been thrown overboard on a bipartisan basis. So we have 4 violent underpinnings of climate change, and I would end by saying what we don't have is a treaty that allows people to migrate because of climate change. President Biden put out an executive order called Climate Change and Migration, very eloquent document. Buried in the document is a statement which is an agreement with the Department of Defense, which over the last 15 years has put out quadrennial reports stating that the largest enemy of the United States on a global scale is climate change. So the constituents of NAFTA and CAFTA countries need a climate change migration treaty. That would be justice, in part. We don't have that. The plan of the United States is to make everybody stay in developing countries, and the developing countries, i.e. Mexico, are supposed to take care of this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our speakers for their passion and their work. Let's give them another round of applause. And we also have some bottles for you.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, since we've run out of time, we're not going to do the Q&A, and instead what we're going to do is let you go to your workshops. So we have 2 sets of workshops. You should see that in your program. And the classrooms are all in this complex, the Center of Fine Arts complex, and there'll be signs in the courtyard and volunteers to help guide you where you need to go. And you can refer to your schedule or your online program for specifics. And then I think, oh yes, and if at the end, if you'd like to come back, but instead of to here, we'll go across to the recital hall where the student exhibits were. It's a little more intimate, and we'll have our closing remarks there. Okay? So thank you, everyone. And as I said, we can go off to your respective workshops. Thank you.